This is a very exciting time to be a business leader in clean tech, in financial services, in basically every single industry, because it appears that the technology likely to have the greatest impact on the world of business, on our institutions, has arrived. But it's not mobility, big data, the cloud, robotics, machine learning, or any of these other technologies, though they are powerful and disruptive in their own right. It's actually the technology behind cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, and it's called the blockchain. We've been researching this topic for the better part of 3 years, and I'm deeply involved in this industry, and we've become convinced that this represents the second generation of the internet. So before I continue, who here has heard the word blockchain? Raise your hand. And who here thinks that they understand it? Okay, you're giving the presentation now. Well, that's very interesting because this is the most important technology to come around in a generation. And it's my hope that today you will, or rather in the future, you might remember today in the same way you might remember a day, a presentation, a conversation you had in 1993 or 1994 when someone finally demystified the internet because this is the second generation. So when you use the internet today, the internet of information, to send and move information around the world, you're not actually sending an original, you're sending a copy, and you're leaving behind an original, leaving a digital trail of breadcrumbs. And that's okay. In fact, it's advantageous in a lot of different use cases. If I send one email, I can send the same email to every single person in the room. If I put up a website, anybody can access it. I can duplicate a PowerPoint presentation over and over again to share with all of you when I'm done here today. This is a great advantage of the internet in that it's democratized information. Except when it comes to things that have value, like money or financial assets or titles and deeds to pieces of property and anything else that has value, sending a copy is actually a really bad idea. If I agree to pay you $20 for something, it's really important that you know that you have that $20 and I don't still have it. And I can't send the same $20 to everyone in this room, because if I could, the $20 would be worthless. I might also go to jail. And that's not fun. So it's great to have a printing press for information, but it's not good to have a printing press for money. Duh. This is something that cryptographers and computer scientists have been trying to resolve, actually, for the better part of 30 years. And it's called the double spend problem or the double payment problem. When you move something, of digital value, a piece of information, how do you ensure that it ends up in one place and not in two places, or doesn't end up still on your computer? And it turns out it's a difficult problem to solve. As a result, we still rely on intermediaries to perform a whole bunch of really important roles in society, third parties. And you would know them as banks, but also big technology companies, those vendors that were referred to in the previous presentation, governments, large centralized power plants and regulated utilities who sit in the middle of transactions and perform these important roles. The first thing they do is they determine the identity of parties in a transaction. You're the buyer, I'm the seller, etc. Then they create trust between those two or more parties. After that, they perform what's called the business logic, basically the clearing and settling of transactions. And then finally, they keep records that can be verified by the parties in that transaction to assure that something occurred, but also by important third parties like regulators and auditors and other groups. And overall, these intermediaries do a pretty good job, but they have some very specific limitations. The first one is that they're all centralized, and anything that's centralized is vulnerable to hacking or to attack or to failure. This is true of LinkedIn, Twitter, Yahoo, but also not obvious ones, like the Con Edison plant in New York City. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York, that plant flooded, and it ended up knocking out power to 2 million people. So when things are centralized, they're vulnerable. They slow things down, and they add cost to the system. In the case of, say, sending money overseas, it's called the remittances market, it can cost upwards of 10% and take 5 to 7 days, which is odd, this cross-border payment idea, because we never say the word cross-border email. Email is information, it just flows freely, but when it comes to moving value, it's this incredibly complicated and cumbersome process, and it ends up hurting individual consumers. They exclude big parts of the population. There are 2.5 billion people in the world who don't have access to basic financial services. One of the reasons, the main reasons, is that they don't have an identity. They don't have a way to prove who they are, a passport, a driver's license, a title or deed to a piece of property, utility bill, any of these things. And that's problematic. They capture data. We saw the explosion of big data, so big it didn't fit on one slide. This data is being created by all of us, but we don't own it. It's owned by these intermediaries, and that's problematic for many reasons. And then the final thing is they seem to be capturing most of the value of the digital age asymmetrically. So what if there was a vast new platform, basically a second generation of the internet, based on a global ledger, a record of everything that was going on and had gone on in the past, where not just information, but anything of value, money, financial assets, carbon credits, units of energy, even votes in an election could be moved, stored, and managed securely and privately, and where trust wasn't established by a third party, but rather through mass collaboration, consensus, cryptography, and clever code. Well, in 2008, the global financial system was basically on the brink of collapse, and somewhat propitiously, I guess, an anonymous person or group of persons named Satoshi Nakamoto outlined this thing called Bitcoin. Who here has heard of Bitcoin? Yeah, people know Bitcoin. Bitcoin was basically designed as cash for the internet. Sounds simple enough, but it didn't exist. A way to make a payment peer-to-peer without using an intermediary. In the same way as if you had €5 and you went to the coffee shop, bought a coffee and a donut, you're not using Visa, you're not using your bank, the vendor's not asking you for your driver's license, you're just making a peer-to-peer transaction. That's what they were trying to design. And it worked so well that it set off a spark that's traveled like wildfire and captured the imagination of people in every single industry around the world and in many of our institutions, including government. So Bitcoin is many things to many people. The first thing it is an asset. It goes up, it goes down, you can buy it, you can sell it, you can make money on it, and that's pretty interesting, if you're a speculator. More interesting is it's a cryptocurrency. That is to say, a currency that's based on cryptography where it's not controlled or issued by a government or by a supranational organization like the European Union. And if you're living in Venezuela or China where there's strict capital controls, or Argentina or many parts of the world, having an alternative to the fiat currency is actually really useful. And it's also very useful for cross-border payments. So that's interesting. But most interestingly is it's based on this thing called the blockchain. So for the first time in human history, two or more parties need not know nor trust one another to transact or do business. Rather than intermediary establishing trust, a distributed network of participants acting in collective self-interest do it instead. It is the first native digital medium for value. And because it's based on trust, we call it the trust protocol. So how does all this stuff work? Well, as I said, it starts with this distributed ledger. Basically, the spreadsheet, not running on one bank, but running on every single computer in the world, accessible to anybody. Transactions are constantly happening on this network. And there are various types of blockchains that perform various types of roles. So this could be anything from sending $20 to trading a unit of electricity to placing a vote in an election. It's a transaction that's occurring in this network. Every so often, kind of like the heartbeat of the network, these transactions are batched into these things called blocks, which are then broadcast out to the network. Now, everyone can see them, but only a few people on the network, or a few institutions, actually have the resources to basically validate those transactions. And they put large computing resources to work to validate them. And in exchange for reaching consensus, basically, on what has occurred, did that transaction happen, was that vote placed, did that purchase occur, they're rewarded, in the case of the Bitcoin blockchain, with more Bitcoin. But there are other ways that they can be rewarded. That block is then added to a chain of blocks, which goes back all the way to the beginning of that blockchain. And this is the very key insight, because instead of just a traditional database, a way to record information, which you might say, why do we need blockchain if we have databases and spreadsheets? This is the key innovation, which is that the information in each block must refer to the information in the previous block, which must refer to the information in the previous block, et cetera, et cetera. What that means in practice is if you wanted to hack a transaction in the first block, say moving the $20 from party A to party B and then again to someone else, or maybe canceling a transaction or something like that, you wouldn't have to just alter that block. You'd have to rewrite the entire history of commerce, all the way back to the beginning of time, in 10 minutes, fighting against the largest computing resource in the world, 10 to 100 times as big as Google. And that's really hard. So I won't say it's unhackable. If I say it's unhackable, it'll get hacked tomorrow. I just know it. But it is an infinitely more secure, better, more stable, more efficient way of moving, storing, and managing value than anything we've devised today. And it turns out that Bitcoin is just the beginning. Who here has heard of Ethereum? Got those guys. So Ethereum is a cool story, started by a 19-year-old college dropout from Toronto, Canada, my hometown, who was a huge advocate and very influential in the Bitcoin community. But in Bitcoin, he saw certain limitations. He thought, well, if we've got this distributed network for moving and storing and managing value, why does it just need to be a currency? Why can't we program intelligence into transactions and into business interactions? So he devised essentially this concept of a smart contract, which is basically what it sounds like. It is software that mimics the logic of a contract with guaranteed execution, enforcement, and payments, and where you don't need to rely on traditional arbiters and intermediaries like banks, escrow agents, lawyers, and courts. Imagine you had software that did everything automatically. And he released a paper about it, asked his friends and the people in his community to help support him. In 2 months, he raised $18 million US, making it the largest crowd sale of all time at that point, later to be surpassed by another blockchain crowd sale. And today, 2 years later, it's worth $1 billion. It's being used by dozens of Fortune 500 companies and may eventually become the basis for transactions in many different kinds of asset classes and potentially whole new models for organizing capability in our economy. $18 million crowd sale, 19-year-old college dropout. So, given the potential and the rate of change here, it's no small wonder why a lot of key stakeholders and media outlets are talking about this as the next big thing. The Economist, this is an old article. This is from the fall of last year. This is almost a year old. They said, blockchain is not one of the most important innovations of the last 200 years. It is one of the most important innovations of the last 200 years, not just the last 20 years, akin to double-entry bookkeeping and the joint stock corporation. Now, admittedly, those aren't the sexiest things out there, double-entry bookkeeping. But they're kind of important. Without them, we wouldn't have the modern economic capitalist system that we know today. So in the book, Blockchain Revolution, we identified 7 key transformations where blockchain could be deeply influential. And one of those 7 was this, 7 transformations for a prosperous world, where we discussed all the ways this technology could help to solve some big global problems. Everything from bringing billions of unbanked people online to solving the problem of land titling in the developing world, where 70% of people who think they own land actually have a very flaky title to it. But today I'd like to talk to you about the impact of blockchain on business, specifically on clean tech. So this is a world-famous economist. His name is Ronald Coase. And among other things, I'd like to know what he ate for breakfast, because he lived till he was 103. Must be all the thinking. So he outlined this basic idea. He asked a simple question. He said, why do we have firms? Why do we have companies? If the best way to organize capability in an economy is in an open market, Adam Smith and classical economics, then how come everyone's not an independent contractor inside of the firm? Or they should be disaggregated, Sales, marketing, manufacturing, procurement, logistics, management, etc. should all be bidding with each other in an open market. Wouldn't that be the most efficient way to organize capability? Why do we have companies? And he pointed to this one thing. And for explaining it, he won the Nobel Prize for economics. He said transaction costs. So long as it's cheaper to do things inside the boundaries of the firm than outside, then companies will continue to grow. So in the early days of capitalism, transaction costs of every kind, all of these, were very high. So Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company and all the other early industrialists understood this implicitly, which is why the Ford Motor Company didn't just make cars. they had a steel plant, they had mines, they had timber mills, they had an entire community in Brazil called Fordlandia that just harvested rubber. It was cheaper to keep everything inside of the firm than outside of the firm. And that's the model of the industrial age corporation, and it remained unchanged for many decades. The internet, the first generation of the internet, helped to change that a little bit. It became easier to communicate across long distances, to collaborate and partner between businesses. And so firms began to unbundle a little bit. In the 90s, the mantra was focus on what you do best, outsource the rest, which eventually led to the business web, where companies realized that most of the capability, most of the expertise to get something done probably weren't in the four walls of the firm. They were probably out there somewhere. So the best way to do that was to partner with other organizations and individuals who had insight and expertise beyond what you might have had. But if you look at the firm today, I actually don't think it looks that much different than companies did, 20 years ago. I mean, really. And the reason, I think, is because the most important transaction costs are not search, they're not communication. They're actually the cost of contracting, the cost of establishing trust, and the cost of negotiating and enforcing contracts. I don't think any of those things have really been transformed in any way by technology. We still rely on intermediaries to perform every single one of those roles. But blockchain can automate that. Smart contracts, as one small example, could help reduce the cost of contracting, reduce the cost and the friction inside organizations. So we could lead to whole new models of organizing value. In the book, we outline this 4 quadrants. So you've got smart contracts. It's basically just a mechanism to allocate value in a predetermined way based on a set of algorithms instead of having to use people. Autonomous agents, unrelated to blockchain, would be the advances in machine learning and AI, which are making many tasks capable by robots and computer simulations rather than people. And we decided that if you were to take smart contracts with autonomous agents, you would get distributed autonomous enterprises, which is basically a company that doesn't really look like a company. It is a collection of people and a collection of software loosely configured in a way where they were performing many of the same roles as a firm. And at the time, we thought that was kind of far out when we put it in the book. We thought that was a little bit, like people might think we were smoking dope. But the day the book launched, this thing called the Distributed Autonomous Organization came into existence. And it was a radically new business model, never really before seen at any scale. And it didn't have any management, and it didn't have a home office or any assets. It actually didn't have any people. It was just a collection of smart contracts designed to make investments in the blockchain industry. And if you bought tokens in this thing, you would get a say in what investments were made. And in the course of 6 weeks, it raised $169 million US, which is the largest crowd sale, if you could even call it that, of all time, like by an order of magnitude, 10 times as big as the last one, which happened to be Ethereum, another blockchain company. So this is a whole new model for how firms can raise money by tapping into the vast wealth of the crowds and doing so in a peer-to-peer way. Let's talk about some of these business models. So we all know about Uber and Airbnb and Lyft and TaskRabbit and these kinds of companies. They're part of the so-called sharing economy. It's a nice notion that we're all sharing together and building value, but it's not true. These companies are not successful because they share. They're successful because they don't share. They aggregate. They aggregate excess capacity through a centralized intermediary, a company, and then they sell it to a willing market, in the process capturing nearly all of the value. Now, they capture 20% of the fee, but the $65 billion that Uber is worth is not shared amongst drivers or passengers. It is owned by the people who own the corporation. So how could blockchain possibly impact these kinds of companies? And what does this mean for clean tech? Well, if you think about what Uber really does, I think it, broadly speaking, performs 5 roles. The first thing it does is identity. You look at your phone. Has everyone used Uber here, by the way? Who? Okay. It's a different conversation in San Francisco. Is that $250 million of revenue in San Fran?
150.
Jeez, that's a lot. So Uber does identity. When you get into an Uber, you look at your phone, you see your driver John, and John's in a Hyundai. And John sees you, Alex, standing on the corner. Identity. The second thing is reputation. John's got a 4 out of 5 or a 5 out of 5 or 4.5 out of 5 star rating, and I do too. He knows whether or not I'm a obnoxious, jerk when I get in the car, or whether or not I always, keep my mouth shut and be polite. So it does reputation, it does identity. The third thing it does is contracting. Actually, when you get into an Uber and you get taken to where you want to go, you're actually entering into a little contract that Uber's enforcing. If that car doesn't come and pick you up, you don't pay. And you're not negotiating with the driver in real time. Someone else is already arbitrating that transaction. They're contracting. Then it does payments. It's integrated with Apple Pay and Visa and your bank and all these kinds of things to make the payment process completely seamless. And the final thing it does is lots of really cool technology. It does autonomous vehicles and Uber Pool and this kind of stuff. The first 4, identity, reputation, payments, and contracting, can all be radically flattened by this technology. So you could have a driver-owned cooperative where everyone pitches in, a few $100s, 100th the cost of a medallion in most cities for a taxi license, to build this kind of a system where the cars and the drivers are their own economic agents. And they're the ones that are contracting and negotiating in real time using blockchain technology. So the fares almost certainly wouldn't be 20%, or rather the cut wouldn't be 20% to Uber. It would be something significantly less. And that means a big threat. Something like Airbnb. Airbnb is really excited by blockchain, actually, because in it they see the opportunity to improve their reputation and identity systems, which is kind of important because occasionally someone trashes a room at Airbnb and puts spray paint and garbage all over the place. If they had a better way to determine identity, then they might be able to reduce their insurance risks. But the question is, couldn't someone else just do it better using this technology and completely put them out of business? Governments are not really prepared for the sharing economy model companies or what's to come next, which is blockchain sharing economy company models. In Toronto, my hometown, they're debating whether or not to build a light rail train system at $500 million a kilometer. Don't they know that in 7 or 8 years, all cars, or at least all new cars that come off the line will have some autonomous vehicle functionality, and that a lot of people probably won't own vehicles, they'll be owned in a commons, and that with this technology, they'll all be driving themselves around, executing transactions in real time? Why on earth do you need an LRT system? What does it mean for the police department? Most of the police budget is spent on enforcing parking violations and speeding violations. Well, if every car is self-driving and nobody's parking because they're being driven around, then you don't actually need that. It frees up resources. Nobody's really thinking about these solutions, certainly not where I come from. Things might be different around here. So, number 2, the rights creators. The music industry, and this has something to do with clean tech too. The music industry. Artists have never really had a good deal since the days of Medici. They've always served at somebody else's pleasure. And this was certainly true during the record label era, which started in earnest in the 20s and was extremely powerful throughout the 20th century. Where if you were an artist, you'd sign with a label and you get a small cut of the action. Just go back to that for a second. And these labels became very, very powerful. The internet came along and it was supposed to solve this problem. It was supposed to remove the intermediary and allow artists to distribute directly to their fans. You didn't need a physical medium like a CD or an LP. You could just sell it online. Except the only problem is the internet took something that was an asset that had value and turned it into information. It put it through the printing press. And when it put it through the printing press, all of a sudden it became worthless. You could basically duplicate music over and over again. So a whole new set of intermediaries stepped in to try and solve the problem. Apple Music, Spotify, in film and TV, Netflix, streaming services. Except things are really bad for artists. In the 80s, if you wrote a hit single and it sold 1 million copies, you could expect to make $45,000. Today, that same song gets 1 million streams on Spotify. You know how much you make? $36. $45,000 to $36. So the system is broken, and artists are fed up. What does blockchain have to do with this? This is Imogen Heap. She's a British singer-songwriter who is using this technology to reinvent the music industry. Songs are already digital, so what else could they do? Well, instead of just being music, couldn't they also have intelligence built into them? Couldn't they have smart contracts that delineate what the licensing arrangement and what the royalty arrangement is? Different amounts are paid to the creators of content depending on how they're consumed, for radio, for streaming, for sampling, for YouTube videos, et cetera. And couldn't you also delineate clearly who owns what? Songwriter 40%, guitar soloist 20%, producer 10, et cetera. And couldn't you develop a system where every time a song was consumed, regardless of how it was consumed, it executed a payment that ensured that artists got compensated first? Well, this is what Imogen Heap is working on. It's a way to turn a song into a business so that artists who are terrible business people, the worst, don't have to go chasing down royalty payments. Right now, it takes about 12 to 18 months for royalty payment to make it into an artist's bank account. My father-in-law, he's a composer. I know this firsthand. Imagine if it happened in a second. And imagine if someone sampled music and put it onto YouTube that artificial intelligence could pick up the melody and pick up the lyrics and know that it was that song and then execute that contract anyway. All of a sudden, the creators of content and value could begin to meter it out in a way where they actually got fed first. This could apply to all sorts of other types of assets. Wikipedia is one of the most incredible innovations that came about because of the internet, but it's in trouble right now, financial trouble, because there's a dedicated group of editors who are out there trying to keep it up to date, constantly fixing things, et cetera, but there's no way to really compensate them. So if they were creators of content that was adopted by Wikipedia, that the community agreed was legitimate, valid, couldn't they then receive a micropayment? And couldn't this apply to many different other types of industries, including potentially the power industry, which is where we get to the metering economy. So there are all sorts of assets out there, including ourselves, that are constantly creating value. We create all sorts of value. But there's no real way to capture that value and to monetize it in any kind of way. Something like a personal carbon credit would be a good example of that. Why can't you, as a citizen, demonstrate that you always take the bus and you always recycle and you turn off your lights and you use low wattage bulbs and that your footprint is very, very small? Couldn't we use sensor technology and the Internet of Things to stream data to a database that everyone knew could be trusted, where you could then offset your bills? You could offset your power bills, you could get a tax credit, et cetera. This is something that should be instituted. There's no reason why it can't be. All you need is connect the Internet of Things, sensor technology, to a blockchain, get buy-in from people. I think a lot of people would be interested in saving money on their power bills. And all of a sudden, boom, you've got a way not only to reduce the footprint, but also for people to feel like they can actually gain monetarily from being green. That would certainly incentivize them. The blockchain supply chain. So what does it mean when you've got a record not only of transactions, but of where things have been, how long they stayed there, who handled them, what their provenance was, where they started? Something like the food industry would be a good example of that. We all want to eat organic food or whatever it might be. But sometimes it's hard to really know where your food comes from. Well, if you had an RFID tag on every cow, and every time it was slaughtered and turned into a burger, you could know exactly which cow you were eating, though you might not want to do that, because it's quite grotesque. You could actually do that. I mean, the idea is that things like, say, palm oil, that comes from Indonesia where orangutans are being killed, or rare earth metals that come from Africa that go into every single iPhone and Android device that we all have here. Wouldn't it be good to know where the provenance of something was and where it went through the supply chain? $600 billion of fraud happens every year in the economy. $300 billion of it is in financial services and supply chain fraud. So something like diamonds would be a good example. There's a company, Everledger, that's working with IBM and the Linux Foundation to move the entire diamond industry basically onto this kind of a platform, where if you really wanted to get your fiance a diamond from Canada and not from Sierra Leone, you could know with 100% certainty every single point in the cycle where that diamond traveled. So you can argue that I think that the blockchain is the new supply chain. The Internet of Things. So by 2020, 50 billion. By 2030, probably 500 billion. I mean, there's an actual exponential curve on this. The vector is insane. And so we talk about this explosion of data. And a lot of it's going to be personal data. It's going to be data about you, your health records, your energy consumption, your transactions between devices and between people and devices. that information and that data and that value needs to be able to move through the system in a way that is secure and private, and also where it is instant and peer-to-peer. For obvious reasons. If you have a light bulb that's metering energy from your neighbor's solar panel at a penny a day, it's not going through the Visa network, where the minimum interchange is 30 cents. It's not even possible. It's literally impossible. So we need a whole new system for moving value. The Internet of Everything needs a ledger of everything. The power industry. So the old model is based on a centralized industrial age system where you've got a main power plant which creates energy and distributes it to a market, usually through a regulated utility, something like that. And there are problems with that. It's centralized, so it's vulnerable to failure or attack, et cetera. It's also inefficient in ways that are unexpected. It's inefficient mostly because power is lost in transmission. If the power plant's 1,000 kilometers away, half the energy is going to just disappear in electrons into the atmosphere. And it's inefficient as well in that most of them burn fossil fuels. So today, there are entrepreneurs using blockchain technology to try and solve this. So it's not just blockchain that's creating new models for power generation. In fact, there are two trends that you'd be more familiar with than I am, mainly, which is that the efficiency of photovoltaic cells, solar cells, has skyrocketed as the cost has plummeted. Battery storage is improving dramatically. And there's this third thing, which is the rise of blockchain technology. So today, you've got a solar panel on your roof. You live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the United States. You've got an installation through Solar City. You generate electricity in excess of what you need and what your puny little battery can handle. You sell it back into the grid at a wholesale rate. And usually it's a small fraction of what the actual going market rate is for that power. And sometimes you can only sell so much back because the grid just can't handle that much electricity flowing back in. So what if you generated electricity in excess of what you needed, which you will because the potential efficiency of this technology is so great, the cells and the batteries, that you were able to sell it in a peer-to-peer way to your neighbors or to a local business, or where the grid itself and the utility was itself another node on the network. And it turns out that's already happening. There's a thing in New York City called the Brooklyn Microgrid, which is a collaboration between a company, LO3 and Consensus. NASDAQ is working on this in California. NASDAQ, we think of a company, it's in the financial services industry. NASDAQ thinks of itself as a technology company whose core competency is markets. So if the energy market is moving to a peer-to-peer system of microgrids in cities all over the country, surely that's a big opportunity. That's how they see it. And this has gotten a lot of press, and it's growing quite rapidly. The platform builders. So who knows what that is? Ever seen that before? In the States, they call it a Rube Goldberg machine. I learned recently there's actually a British equivalent of this. I don't know what it's called, but basically, a Rube Goldberg machine is an apparatus that does a whole bunch of really complicated, sometimes useless things, and in the end, it solves a very simple problem, like it closes a door or cracks an egg. This is basically how the financial services industry works, where you go to Starbucks and you tap your card on the card reader, and you think that the money is going peer-to-peer to the merchant, but it's not. It's actually going through a Byzantine system of intermediaries, sometimes 5 or 6 intermediaries. The merchant's bank, your bank, credit card processor, risk management company, Visa network, clearinghouse. And it takes days to settle and can cost the merchant a couple %. For a lot of internet merchants, the interchange, as it's called, can be sometimes 7 or 8 or 9%, which if your profit margin is 15% is a lot. In something like high-frequency trading, for example, these are the guys, the flash boys, right, who trade in nanoseconds in stocks and other assets. And they need this time advantage so much that they park their trading desks physically next to the exchange's servers so that the information travels 10 feet instead of 10 miles. But when it comes time to clear and settle that transaction, it takes 3 days. Same time it would take if it was a mom and pop investor in like middle America. So there's digital wallpaper that's concealing this inefficient analog Rube Goldberg machine of how this stuff works. And this is true in a lot of different industries. And in financial services, where each of these different, there are people here I know for the venture capital world who would know this really well. all of these different areas, there are problems. These are the 8 kind of components of the industry. Even something like accounting for value, doing the accounting function, which is relevant, of course, to the energy industry too, keeping track of debits and credits and payments in the marketplace is completely broken. You know, we do accounting, we reconcile records with the phases of the moon every 3 months, every quarter. How come we can't do that in real time? How come every time you enter a transaction, it doesn't just record a debit and a credit, it also records a third entry, which is time-stamped in a ledger that anybody who's important stakeholders, say the shareholders or the regulator, can see in real time. Cut back on accounting fraud, it would cut back on human error, and it would enable whole new types of business models that current accounting methods basically prohibit. So somebody sent me an article about this, and I knew I was going to be talking to you today. So the Luxembourg Green Exchange just basically went into business, I guess, about a week and a half ago. You know, the first marketplace for financial assets that are explicitly green. They go towards funding a project that will advance clean tech, basically. And it's a great idea, and it's something that whoever created it and whoever is involved with this should think about how blockchain plays into that. So why do you need an intermediary with market hours that it convenes buyers and sellers of assets of any kind, whether it's power or stocks or bonds in clean tech projects? How come this can't happen in a distributed, disaggregated way where we all have value on our devices, whatever those might be, and we can trade and buy and sell that in real time? So whoever wants to reinvent the financial services industry, there's a $10 trillion opportunity. Linux is giving it a shot. Linux is the open source foundation started by Linus Torvald, who developed, is he Finnish? Oh, yeah. One of the great heroes of the internet, seriously, developed the Linux Foundation. The technology goes into all of the operating systems in the world, actually. People think it's just Android, but it's not. Like half of iOS, Apple, which is supposed to be super proprietary, is actually based off the Linux kernel. It's actually incredible. So they know what they're doing when it comes to building big global resources that are used by everyone. Maybe they're the ones to make it happen, not just for finance, but for other areas. And the final one is bigger, better data. Let's talk about fracking. Not oil fracking, though, data fracking. So there's been this creation of a whole new asset class over the past 25 years. And it's the most important asset class of the digital age. It's called data. It's as important to this economy as industrial plant and equipment was in the industrial age, or land was in the agrarian age. Except there's a funny thing about this big, incredible new asset class. We all create it, me and you and everyone here, and everyone in the world. We don't own it. We don't control it. It's owned and controlled by your bank, by your government, by Facebook, by Apple, by Uber, by other intermediaries that sit in the middle, establish trust, process payments, keep records, etc. And it turns out that there's a virtual you out there. That's the virtual me with a huge head. And the virtual you knows more about you than you know about you. You don't know exactly what you bought, where you went, what you said, what you did 1 year ago today to this day, but the virtual you does. And I can tell you with the IoT and sensor technology, the virtual you will really know. It'll know what your heart rate was, whether you had a bead of sweat going down your brow, et cetera. So that's problematic that this virtual you is not owned by us for a lot of reasons. For one, we can't use that information to manage our affairs as well as we would like if we had access to it. But the bigger issue, of course, is what it means for us as individuals, for our privacy. It's obviously a problem in places like Russia and China and Iran and elsewhere. But it's wrong for us, even in the West, democratic countries, to assume that governments and companies are always acting in our best interests. Sometimes they're not. Doesn't mean they're evil, but it just doesn't mean that our interests don't always align. And privacy is a precondition for a free society. So how can we take our data back? Well, imagine that the virtual you wasn't owned by intermediaries, it was owned by you. And in that, there were different versions of you. There was you, the citizen of Finland. There was you, the customer of your bank. There was you, the employee at your corporation. There was you, the user of social media, etc. And you only had to divulge what was absolutely necessary to get access to a certain service. So, you want to buy something online? The merchant doesn't really need to know much about you other than you've got the money, period. But you want to get a loan from the bank. Might be helpful if they knew a little bit about you, whether or not you pay back loans, for example. That would be helpful. And now we can empower individuals to take control of more of that information. So let's say instead of just your credit score, which is what they use in North America to determine whether or not you're creditworthy, you could also use your history on eBay, your social media clout, your history with micro lenders, or any other interaction you might have had that could attest to what kind of a person you were to get access to more services. The whole idea here is that the data is worth something. It has value. And instead of it just being owned and aggregated by other institutions, you own and control it, and you can use it as a way to protect yourself, but also as a way to gain access, to monetize it, to get more goods and services. And this is applicable in lots of different industries. So these are 7 business models, part of one chapter, which is new business models, part of an 11-chapter book called Blockchain Revolution. And it's a very exciting time to be a business leader, as I said. But it's also a perilous time in the world, I think. We are in the midst of a crisis of legitimacy that's taken hold of the Western world, so to speak, that has put, I think, democracy and capitalism in retreat and populism and authoritarianism on the advance. And it's a big problem. And it's a problem, I think, largely because a lot of people believe government doesn't act in their best interests, that they're corrupted, that they're illegitimate in some way. Places like the United States, they have reason to think that. 90% of Americans, when polled, want to see a background check on firearms. Congress cannot pass a bill that reflects the will of the people. There are campaign finance rules in place that make elected officials beholden to corporate interests and not to citizens. These are issues that are deeply corrosive to democracy in a free society. So, what if a government official got elected with a smart contract that said that they only get paid if they actually do what they said they were supposed to do? What a concept! You would make them abide by their commitments and act with integrity using technology. Wow, what a concept. Couldn't that help in some ways to restore legitimacy? There's so many other examples. It's an entire chapter in the book. So I'm very enthusiastic about this, as you might be able to tell. But there are lots of reasons why blockchain could get sidetracked, derailed, not fulfill its potential. And there were so many of them that we came across, we decided to basically dedicate a whole chapter to it. It's called Showstoppers, Why Blockchain Might Fail. Everything from basic technical issues, is it scalable, is it secure, to policy issues, how will governments respond? Will they use it as a tool to try and create a surveillance society, or will they try and stifle it with regulations? Will it be a job killer? Will it create Skynet from Terminator? After seeing that video, I'm convinced it will, actually. It's terrifying. These are big issues. So the question is, are they reasons that blockchain's a bad idea, or are they implementation challenges to be overcome? And I think each of them is an implementation challenge. It requires leadership. So how can you guys get started? Personal use. Go get a wallet and get some Bitcoin and just move some money around. You'll get a feel for it. You'll be able to start imagining how this could be any other kind of asset, which it soon will be. Carbon credits, units of power, shares in companies, all this kind of stuff. It's a new world we're living in. It's peer-to-peer and it's decentralized. The best way to understand it is personal use. Education. The first thing you should all do, the moment I'm done speaking, is buy my book in massive volume for all your friends. Isn't Santa Claus Finnish? Okay, everyone here is Santa Claus. Go buy the book. No. Go online and just immerse yourself in what's going on. Search your industry. You'll be shocked to know what's happening in this all over the world. It's not like the first generation of the internet where there was kind of Silicon Valley and a few other hubs where this was happening. This is everywhere. And innovation's coming from really surprising places, so get educated. Launch a pilot. Think big, but start small. And partner. There are tons of great startups, probably many of them who are here today, who if you're a business leader, you can engage with to launch something in your industry and might soon turn into something a lot more interesting. And start now. It's very likely that the blockchain revolution will happen faster than the internet revolution because the preconditions are already there. In the 90s, when the World Wide Web was launched by Tim Berners-Lee, 20 million people had a personal computer. Today, half the world's population has a supercomputer, smartphone. And we have internet ubiquity around the world, 5G in Finland, 3G in a lot of parts of the world. This is going to happen fast. So it appears that once again, the technology genie has been unleashed from the bottle. Summoned by an unknown person or persons at an uncertain time in history, the genie is once again at our disposal to transform the economic power grid and the actual power grid and the old order of human affairs for the better, but if we will it. So I ask you to please join the revolution. Thank you very much.